relationships with survivors. And one of the things that I want to talk to you about is trying to figure out how to think about testimony in a way that can be useful in the classroom, but also thinking about testimony in ways that we don't necessarily always think about or understand the way they are presented.
Just a clarification question.
Sure.
When we talk about survivors and their testimonies,
Mm-hmm.
how do we deem a survivor? Is it one who's just been through the camps, or one who escaped through Russia, or one who hid in a cellar? So just for me, for my personal understanding, today, when we're going to be talking about survivors, how are we going, into what context are we putting them?
So it's a good question. The question of who is a survivor has been a question for many reasons. On an emotional level, it talks about the validation of a story, right? So whose story is considered in and who's considered not, right? And it has evolved over time, which is interesting in and of itself. I would say that today, in 2018, including a survivor of Warsaw as being someone who was affected by the Nazi occupation, right? It's really, we've gone to the most general, but we're living in Nazi-occupied Europe, or left from 1939 and fled to the Soviet Union, but they had been affected. They were physically living. The question of, you could talk about children who went in the kinder transport. They weren't considered survivors of the Holocaust. Now they are considered survivors of the Holocaust. Even the people who survived the war in the former Soviet Union are now considered survivors of the Holocaust. A few years ago, they weren't considered. It's an issue of validation, but interestingly enough, it's connected to compensation. I mean, that's why it's become political. Who gets to claim compensation from the Claims Conference in Germany and so forth and so on. But so that's on the one hand compensation. On an emotional level, the idea of who is a survivor has been connected not so much to compensation, but to their own internal hierarchy of suffering. Who is a survivor? Undoubtedly, a survivor was a person who survived a camp, right? But up until the 1990s, children who had been hid during the war didn't see themselves as survivors. They didn't see themselves as survivors, and they weren't regarded as part of they might have intellectually been seen as survivors, but they didn't even self-identify, because they saw themselves as not having experienced a camp, or even though themselves would have felt guilty of not being in a camp and only have survived. Survivors themselves saw them as, oh, you survived in hiding, but we were in a camp. And within their own world, there was a hierarchy of suffering. Interesting enough, with children who survived in hiding, there was also a very painful issue about not being recognized, because a lot of adult survivors would look at children who had survived in hiding as a problem for them personally, because they had managed to necessarily save their own child through hiding. Right? So there's a lot of very complicated issues connected to it, where young children didn't speak and didn't identify because of the guilt or the difficulty that they faced, and also the whole idea was that you were too young, you couldn't possibly remember. So if you don't remember the story, are you then considered a survivor? All these different issues came to play, and only in the 1990s did children who survived the war in hiding predominantly really start speaking about their experiences. And it also has to do with historical time, because the adult survivor generation had started to age and started to pass away, and then came in this whole other experience of children which had not been heard, and then was given more space. And that's why today we even have the widening of the identity, because the less and less of the traditional survivor we have, the more we include people who had been on outliers, which is a whole interesting dynamic. Yeah.
In terms of the child survivors coming out more in the 90s, how much do you attribute that to the psychosocial literature that was being developed? I'm thinking of Helen, the Canadian writer,
Epstein.
Helen Epstein, and Paul violent,
Yeah.
and in fact, you know, the kind of secondary suffering of the children who were hidden and the kind of abuses that he highlights that in his book. So.
Absolutely. Well, it's almost a kind of chicken and an egg situation. You know, the literature. The 90s is the beginning of a discussion, but it also fits in to survivors, and this is why what I wrote. It's also connected to biographical time, because at a certain point, normative psychology talks about the fact that when people are aging, they go through a process of wanting to integrate their lives and tell a life story. It's Erickson's idea. And the idea is that when people age, they start reflecting. And that, the 90s, started to fall into place for child survivors of looking back and thinking who they were and what should they tell and what should they share. That almost normative biological urge, one could say, then also opens up the discussion, but researchers also start looking at it. So it all dovetails with child survivors in the 90s. And what's also interesting is that you also have the biological time of grandchildren, which the third generation opens up the conversations more than the first, in the second generation. So that's an important piece in it as well for children. So it all comes in the 90s, where all of these factors are coming into play, but certainly, without a doubt, Deborah Dwork's book on children during the Holocaust, about really documenting what happened to children as a specific group, brings to fore the issue, and then we start having psychological literature, more people speaking, and it creates a momentum as almost the establishment of a field which hadn't existed before. Same so for the experience of women as a particular victim group. Women as a particular victim group had not been discussed as as a group who had experienced the Shoah in a different way. And at the late 80s, there was a whole big discussion, which is basically fueled by a feminist discourse, that let's look at women. And then there's a whole big discussion. Should we look at women? Because then it becomes political. But let's look at... But if you're a woman and you're arriving in Auschwitz-Birkenau on a ramp and you're pregnant, gender is destiny. You know, you are sent straight to the gas chamber, even though you can work, right? So how can you not look at gender as a factor? So the literature brings forth, and then the experience of women and the literature about writing a woman as a separate group starts. So it becomes... all of these forces, whether it's a greater discourse, whether it's a biological time, whether it's an emotional time, all brings to forth certain issues, and then you have the opening up of a field. And now we have a big opening up of the field of Jews who fled to the Soviet Union in 1939, 250,000 of them who fled.
Opportunity,
yes,
particularly for Russian Jews.
Exactly, who fled eastward,
Yeah.
And survived the war under difficult and awful conditions, but then came back to Poland essentially after the war, looked for any relatives, didn't find them, their entire lives had been destroyed, and then they also came back and were actually in the DP camps with the other survivors of Nazi persecution during 1939 to 1945, and a lot of the great wave of immigration is made up of Jews who fled to the Soviet Union, but they weren't recognized as survivors of the Holocaust because they hadn't survived Nazi occupation. Only now is there a recognition of them as a group, and more research is being done on this particular group, because the enormity of their loss really did destroy their lives and their families and their community. So things start shifting, and we're at a point today, which also is about biological time, where we have really the last group of survivors who are with us, still with us. And within the next 10 to 15 years, we're no longer going to have that community. And so therefore, it is almost natural that it has become all-inclusive, particularly because there are very real physical needs that survivors face today, who are aging and don't necessarily all have the right finances and financial backing to be able to live their aging life with dignity. And the group that is most vulnerable are those Jews who fled to the Soviet Union and who actually lived in the Soviet Union in the 1990s, came to Israel on Aliyah, but had not accrued a pension over years of living, because they left in the 1990s and had to basically restart in Israel at the age of 60, and really don't have the financial foundation to live a dignified aging, as well as survivors who would have come perhaps in the 80s to to Australia from the former Soviet Union. So it's very connected today as to validation, but also to a physical need of being able to look after and claim compensation for damage and damages. Also testimony and the giving of survivor testimony has all of these features and is influenced by all of our biographical time, by historical time and emotional time. Which I'm framing is really about context. That we cannot teach the Shoah generally, but we cannot teach survivor testimony without giving a context to their testimony. The context of the testimony is, on the one hand, the historical context to that person's particular story. So if a survivor is talking about their experiences in Italy, or they're talking about Greece, or they're talking about Poland, or they're talking about Lithuania, we can't just bring in a testimony as a survivor to tell the whole story of the Shoah, because each survivor is coming from a community, and each community was influenced by very specific Nazi policy. Very specific Nazi policy, which is different all over Europe, and is influenced by not only the policy, but also influenced by the culture and the context in which they lived up until their persecution. For example, a Greek Jew arriving in Auschwitz has no way to navigate the world of Birkenau because they simply don't have the language, right? So not being able to speak Polish or Yiddish in a camp is a great disadvantage for a prisoner, right? You can't communicate, you can't form a network of relationship, you can't understand the German, you can't understand what's going on. And they talk about, Primo Levi is very, very vivid in his description of how people without the language cannot survive a camp. Right. So
like
even
they had one another, they were a very close and strong knit community.
But we
look,
they do, because they have to find a way, but they still can't understand a Nazi instruction. If you can't understand a Nazi instruction, it's not very useful. Right, so you have to, so on the level of language, the level of culture, to the level of reacting to and behavior, it all matters during the period. So we bring a testimony in, we have to frame where is the survivor from, what is the history of that community, and what is the history of Nazi persecution in that community, and essentially also the choices they faced after the war. We know by and large that, for example, most Jews who had come from Western Europe and who survived the Shoah went back to Western Europe after the war. And most Jews who were living in Poland and in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, who survived the war, left Eastern Europe. So even the end of their story is very much determined about where geographically they were located before the war. Right? So the choices they were making are very much influenced by their geography. And so the context of understanding who the survivor is. And for example, the important story of Australian survivors, which is one of the greatest survivor populations per capita in the world, why are they coming to Australia? They're coming to Australia immediately after the war, but there's very limited visas which are offered. Then they're coming later when there's a greater opening of survivors, or they're coming after 1968 in Hungary, for example, or the Czech Republic after communism starts closing in. Their experience between 45 and 68 in post-war Hungary is very, very important. It's very, very interesting and has a particular context. So we have to try, when we bring in a testimony, to try and frame that person's individual story. Not only for them, students, to understand a little bit more about, but also to understand the enormity of what we're talking about here. We're talking about a pan-European experience. There's not one survivor, there's not one survivor story, there's not one death camp, right? The more we bring in of the different types of experience is a horrible word, the more we're able to give us a little bit of a sense of the extent of the event itself. It's not just Poland, and it's not just these are the major populations where Jews lived, but we're talking about communities from Greece to the Netherlands to Italy to all over Europe, North Africa. And that's another population that's just starting to be recognised as well. Jews who were in North Africa during the Shoah, which was also never seen, not only in terms of compensation, but even research. You will not find very much research, academic research on the Jews of North Africa during Nazi occupation. I'm not saying that they didn't suffer, but how they suffered and in what way is is different to what happens on the main continent, but they have their own story. So we have to, that's the first thing that's important. Now obviously it depends what age and what stage, but you cannot just introduce testimony without a historic background, in my mind. The second thing that we have to try and think about when we look at testimony is, or we teach using testimony, is first, I would say, really to understand or to give a sense of an appreciation for what it means for a survivor to tell their story. What does that process actually involve? We're so used to, luckily, having survivors with us, we're so used to looking at testimony collections which are vast and sophisticated, and we're talking about over 100,000 survivor testimonies given that are available worldwide in different collections. That's an enormous amount of data, because, and I say data because it's become digital, and we're dealing with massive amount of data. But anywhere between half an hour to some testimony collections where survivors given testimony for 20 hours, 25 hours, enormous amounts of story. And so we almost assume that this has always been there since time immemorial, and we have to understand that it really hasn't been. Survivor testimony as we know it, Shoah Foundation, all the collections and all the different museums here in Sydney, here in Melbourne, all of the wonderful work that communities have done in North America, in Israel, is really mainly a product of the late 80s and 90s. So when we see the survivor from these collections, we are basically not seeing a survivor who has essentially been at an older stage in their life, right? I'm going to focus on one particular survivor just because it's a very important example. Here is one of the most recent images or visions, or maybe if you just go to the images of a survivor, Pintas Goethe, who this is his
president and CEO.
Maybe the images will be better, I suppose.
I was at 5. I knew.
Sorry, let me just go. No, it's not me. It's not confusing. Sorry. I'll give it more graphic. Okay. If we can see, this is a series of images of Pintas Goethe. Pintas Goethe currently lives in Canada. He was born in Lodz in 1939. When the Nazis invaded Lodz, his family decided to flee to Warsaw, so they're moving eastward, northeastward. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, he was sent with his mother and his twin sister Sabina. He was 9 years old when the war broke out. His father, who looked more Jewish looking, couldn't travel the train. He went on foot to Warsaw. It took him about 2 to 3 weeks. Pintas and his mother and his sister went to Warsaw to an aunt, and were in the Warsaw Ghetto from 1939 until the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, when they were
19th of April.
They were caught and they were basically they were deported to Majdanek. In Majdanek, Pintas Goethe was separated from his mother and his sister. His mother and his sister were gassed immediately after arrival. He was sent into the showers with his father. He was disinfected. His father was gassed. Pintas Goethe then goes into Majdanek for 6 weeks alone, and he manages to survive Majdanek. From Majdanek, he is deported to Szkazicko-Kamina, to a work camp. From Szkazicko-Kamina, he is sent to Buchenwald. From Buchenwald, he is deported to Kolditz. From Kolditz, he is sent on a death march to Theresienstadt, where he is liberated, and he is just 13. Okay. So within this period of time, Pintas Goethe has lost everybody. He has been through all of these awful experiences, awful camps After the war, Pinchas comes to Israel, becomes part of the IDF, fights in the War of Independence, meets Dorothy, who is actually a South African immigrant, Ola. They get married and they decide to go to Brazil to try and make a living. He spends a year in Brazil and eventually moves to South Africa, where they live for about 20 years, then eventually moves to Toronto, Canada. So a very, very rich and long life. He has 3 children and 3 grandchildren. Pintas Goethe, and if you Google him, he's all over the internet. Why is he all over the internet? He's all over the internet because of this particular project. It's a project that's done by the USC, the University of Southern California, which was the collection belonged to the Spielberg Foundation, where essentially Stephen Smith, who's the CEO of the USC, met Pintas Goethe in the 90s and was totally enthralled with his story, and basically became one of the main motivators for Pintas Goethe to tell his story. Because up until the late 80s, Pintas Goethe had not told his story. He hadn't given testimony, he hadn't given witness statement. The only one he spoke to was his wife on occasion, but even then he didn't speak. And one of the reasons why he didn't speak is that he tells the story of one day feeling that he had the need nonetheless to tell his daughter about her grandparents, and basically at some point he looked up and he saw his daughter doing this, and he decided that he's not going to talk about his experiences at all. So there's an external trigger that's telling Pintas Goethe, I can't listen. Now, for many survivors, the I can't listen was very much part of the societies and the communities in which they lived. People generally, I would say, don't always like to listen to other people's trauma. It takes a very special person to listen to trauma. That's where we have certain people who make that there's life work in the field of mental health. But people, for some reason, aren't always listening for hours and hours and hours to people's very difficult experiences, for whatever reason. Survivors of the Shoah found that the literature talks about an unreceptive audience in the diaspora and in Israel. That people, for all sorts of reasons, weren't willing to really listen. Weren't willing to listen here. And not necessarily because they had their own things to do or they were self-occupied, which there's that. But just for one example, in the state of Israel, people were very critical about the fact that survivors didn't speak about the past. And at some point, I'll remember her, the historian Anita Shapira talked about the fact that, it was very difficult to hear about survivors speaking about their past because the people living in Israel at the time had lost most of their parents and their grandparents in Poland. And they were living in Israel, relatively secure and safe. And the idea that they had died and they had survived was just too painful to think about what actually happened there, because they were talking about their actual siblings, they were talking about their parents, the death camps of all of these places and the awful way they were treated. People just couldn't hear, because it wasn't just because I just can't listen because it doesn't suit me, but it was really just quite painful. And there are so many reasons why people couldn't hear. Yeah.
Tom Jacoby in the 7th Million documents how in Israel, really until the Eichmann trial, Israelis were so caught up in being sabras and strong and settling the land that the concept of a weak Jew that was herded into the camps was antithetical to what their vision, and it was really the Eichmann trial that opened people's eyes to what actually happened. And I also add to that my own experience. I was in the Rose Hall at the age of 11 on Yom HaShoah, watching film from the concentration camps that the British and the Americans took, and that was our Holocaust education in 1967. And I was it was so horrifying that you couldn't mediate in any way. And I think that for my generation, and most of the kids in my year were children of Holocaust survivors, they just couldn't, it was just so horrible and terrible. There was no way of relating or identifying with it, except having nightmares.
Right. Yep.
So I
am third, so I'm second generation. I'm not a child of survivors. My grandparents went through the war and had a different experience because they weren't in camps. They were in a Ukrainian village and there was a mass grave. That's how they died, but great-grandparents. Our Hebrew teacher in Year 12, when we were studying with Rich in VCE level, was telling us, we were discussing a story that was sort of discussing the generation gap between the Holocaust survivor parents and their children in Israel. And she spoke to exactly that. She said, growing up in Israel, she was an Israeli, growing up in Israel, she said the Holocaust was something that was from the past. And until the Eichmann trial, which she heard on the radio, she said it was such a huge watershed moment for her. She started crying into her pillow. Like, it's real. It wasn't just like the destruction of the temple. It was actually something that happened and these people were alive. She said she didn't know it and she was sort of angry at her parents for not explaining it to her. She said, but the culture was that the Jew in Israel was different and was a strong, brave, new person, and they didn't want to identify with what they perceived as the weak European. And she said it was really hard for her to come to terms with it at the time exactly of the Eichmann trial, which was when it first, she had to assimilate, her understanding of being brought up as a Sabra and being modern and Israeli and having this
European testimonies publicly for the first time.
Of something that wasn't, 200 years ago, but was actually real and in her parents' history. So.
No, it's fascinating because you've got so many levels going on in terms of, look, Israeli society needed to be fighting and needed to win its wars and couldn't focus on the tragedy of the past. It needed a strong role model. The strong role model was Mordechai and Levitch. These are the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Gabor. These are the people who are telling their stories because they are taught, and that's what's important. They have a story that they can tell. That's tellable. What is tellable about surviving, being shot in a mass grave, and managing to claw yourself out? Right. That's Rivka Yoselevska at the Eichmann trial. Talking, how can you tell the story of that experience? Is it a story? It's not a story, but what survivors do eventually is they make a story of what's not a story. So there is something that they can communicate. But how can you really talk about the fact that you're carrying your daughter and you're marching to the mass grave and you see your family being shot in front of you and they're all naked, and then you're shot and your daughter's shot, and then you manage to find out somehow that you're still alive, struggle, and her testimony is brutal. How did she ever manage to find the words to tell that story of survival? That's what's happening here. On the one hand, we can talk about, that's the internal obstacles to telling, right? The external is we can't hear. We can't hear because we want to be subras, we want to be resistors. We can't hear because we don't want to care for the new immigrants, look after. We don't want to, they're a Rachmanis, right? They're going to cause anti-Semitism. British Jewry, right? They're going to be a burden. It's going to affect our position that we've worked so hard to achieve, right? And this is not a trope that's post-war. This is 1880s. Here come the Ostjuden into Germany. We don't want to look after the Eastern European Jews because they're going to undo our emancipation. So we'll get Ort is established to look after. It's part of looking after the newcomer. So in a way, will the newcomer affect my own stability and security of what I've worked so hard to achieve? And it's not necessarily something uniquely Shoah. It's not necessarily uniquely Jewish. It's a way immigrant is treated in a society who is vulnerable. Now, they had no idea what these people experienced, had no inkling, and if they started to listen, it was too painful. It was my mother, it was my grandmother, it was my... In terms of the survivor themselves, how do I tell that story of clawing my way out of a mass grave? How do I? What words? And will words ever give any sort of indication of what the experience might mean? So the frustration of, this is all I have is this language, as Primo Levi says, free language, right? I'm speaking today in security. How can I ever access that awful place? And not only that, will they ever understand what I'm saying? Why the hell should I try and find a way to speak when you won't understand what I'm talking about? You won't be able to grasp. Like, why would I try if I find it impossible to communicate my experience, and for you, and not as a judgment, but how can you, understand what I'm saying? Yeah, Helen?
I think yes, but yes to everything, because you can't just negate it. You can't. So that's not part of the question. I remember reading and learning all through school about the numbers and the 6 million and the 6 million and millions and hundreds of thousands of people from here and hundreds of others. To me it was all numbers. It was just numbers. I couldn't imagine it. It wasn't until I was an adult and travelled to Poland and stood at the gates, and as far as my eye could see, that the barracks just kept going further and further and further and further. Did I ever realise how big that number, with whatever number it was 550,000, was it 2,000, was it 6, was it a million? I never envisaged how big was until I couldn't see that far. And that to me was a turning point in my life. But would I say everybody has to go to Poland? No. So when you've got people who can tell you what happened, how do you tell children that what they saw was real? Like, until I didn't learn, took me most of my life to go and know that what I was listening to was real. I was an adult before I could understand the intensity, the size, the magnitude of what that. So how do you propose to change that?
I know that the early college for the last 10 years have been engaged in collecting buttons.
In collecting buttons, yes. Yes.
And I know that personally because I initiated the buttons many, many years ago. It took us over 10 years to get 1.5 million buttons.
So that probably hit
That
you
came from
as
the
well.
children. What does that number look like? But when we started to investigate the global number of 1.5 million, how did Yad Vashem arrive at that number? Pay a copper to get to some of the accounts. But the records are not as clear, so the mathematical equation that we got was to divide it by 4, the global number of people who died, and that's how they derived out the number of children, and that's how they calculated a global number of 1 million.
Okay, but
numbers ever a way to teach?
Okay, so that's the question. So
No,
look, no,
but
wait,
it's
just
not
let's just
just
wait.
the
No, let's just wait. Let's just get. Let's not.
them paper clips.
Let's not get into the issue of how to teach in terms of classroom. I want you to try to understand, because this is really our most important resource. No, it really is. There's nothing like survivor testimony in terms of communicating a different experience. Now, we had interaction and we had question and answers up until now with them. We're not going to have it. This is what we're going to have in the next 10, 15. How do we make sense of it? Now, buttons, it's nice, it's collective, it's active, but seriously, does it really talk about, do you know anything about the Holocaust by collecting 1.5 million buttons?
Stories that emerged to
But I'm saying in terms of it's a technique to use to try and figure out the enormity. But in terms of the experience, it's not an experience based. It's not an experience unless you telling 1.5 million stories, which you don't have. Now, but
many hundreds of stories.
I see, but that's what it is. It's about these stories. This is the power. It's not the methodology. The power lies here. How do we use this to try? Now, on the one hand, these are stories that educationally are inappropriate to be shown, right? If Pintas Goethe, in his testimony of Majdanek, talks about the fact that he was watching young boys raped at night and then hung afterwards in his barrack, I don't think I can really show that to, at least, definitely not to primary school. I don't even know when I can start showing in high school, right? So a lot of what we have here is, most of it is not even appropriate to even show.
Can't use it.
You can't use it. You can't use it. But what we can use when it's younger is the fact that here we have a man who is identifiably an individual, a person, and almost a grandfather image in all of their lives. This is a story about human beings, what happened to human beings, and not necessarily bringing in the 1.5 million or the 6 million, because the numbers are, and we know that the numbers are probably going to be more than we actually even thought of, but this is about the story of one person's miraculous escape, because Pintas Goethe is one and a fourth that escaped. Now, that's even a good average. Survivors are unique. They're a miracle, whatever term you want to use. This is not the fate of European Jews. These are the rare exceptions that managed to get out. Majority of them were murdered. So most of the stories we have are gone. And what's important for us to understand when we teach with testimony is that Pintas Goethe only starts telling his story because he understands that at some point, if he doesn't tell his story, then not just his story won't be known, but more importantly, the story of his sister Sabina and his father Mordechai and his mother, and I forgot her name and I feel terrible about it, but I will try and get it for you. If he doesn't tell their story, it won't even exist. It's as if they didn't even exist, right? So the imperative of the survivor is, even though no one necessarily wants to hear, or in fact I can't find the words, I can't communicate, I can't transmit, or even more difficult is that if I tell my story to a group of people, it means I have to actually think about it again. I have to remember Majdanek and Buchenwald and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising when I don't necessarily want to be doing that. Or not only do I have to conjure up the images again, I might be having to have nightmares about it when I go home. The price of telling is bringing up the memory. Now, we could say they want to remember, but they actually don't really want to remember, because remembering, and that's what survivors are stopping to speak in the first 10, 15, 20 years of their lives, is because they want to rebuild. If I'm going to speak and speak and speak and speak, how much energy do I have to rebuild? And I'm not going to tell my children because I don't want them to become traumatized. So I keep it to myself. I don't want them to do this. I want them to see me as a father and as an engineer and as a person who's created a life. So speaking will take away anything that helps me rebuild. Now, there's some people who spoke incessantly from the war till the end of their days. There's some people who've never opened their mouths till the end of the days. And we don't know psychologically which was the better coping mechanism. Each worked for each person. We know there are survivors that never made it out of a psychiatric institution. And we know survivors who were fine, functioning, and then collapsed, or then had a breakdown. Or with even in that, a fine functioning collapse, have a breakdown, fine functioning, have a alcohol abuse, attempted suicides, people who are dealing with this kind of trauma on a daily basis. And speaking, repeatedly, doesn't necessarily heal them. It gives them a sense of mission that they have passed on their story to the next generation, but it's not necessarily something that takes away the pain. So those are contexts that we have to talk about. The fact that we have these wonderful videos means that someone has made an enormous commitment on their own part to bring up and relive those memories, with the understanding, a very deep understanding, that they probably won't be understood. And the experience will never really be understood, and then they might not even really communicate what they can. Also, the fact that they understand that there are certain parts of their stories that they cannot tell because they don't remember. There are certain parts of their stories they cannot tell because it's too shameful to talk about. Right? We know that women who experienced sexual violence during the Shoah didn't speak about their sexual violence, but only now in the last 10, 15 years has that been something that survivors are starting to speak about. Men survivors didn't speak about their sexual violence. At some point it will perhaps be spoken about if we have time, right? And whether or not someone in their testimony, for example, is going to talk about the fact that they stole a bread from a loved one or a child. Are they going to talk about that on a public testimony given to the Shoah Foundation? There are certain unsayable elements which are not there. Pintas Goethe, who speaks constantly, time and time again, says there are certain parts of my story I will never tell to anybody. Who knows what those pieces are? Why he omits them? Because, and that's part of the dynamic of what we hear. But every time he speaks, he takes the chance of him having to reface those images and that experience. So when we introduce testimony, we need to have students aware of what it actually means to give it in the first place. Not saying that it's not empowering, and not saying that for many survivors it hasn't given them a mission, it hasn't given them a sense of belonging, of educating. They're not survivors anymore. They see themselves as witnesses, and today they see themselves as educators. And when the survivor goes and gives their testimony to groups in Poland or in Germany, they have this whole busload of people who are walking with them, who are listening to them, who are hugging them, who are looking after them. Their storytelling does bring care, and it does bring love. And it's not that it doesn't bring anything. It brings a lot for that validation that many didn't get in those first post-war years. But it still is them with their memory and their loss. No child and no group and no will ever reverse the damage that has happened to them. This just gives them that audience of someone who says, we care about what happened to you. Now, we care about what happened to you is restorative on some level for a survivor. So testimony is a very, we can't take it for granted because it's taken so long to get to this level. Pintas Goethe only started talking about it in the late 80s. He goes and speaks now constantly. What's interesting, I mean, if you look at his the images of him, he's all over with so many people, institutions, and here is a very important part of this is one of his earliest testimonies, right? You can see, which is important to show, the biographical time of how a person's speaking the same story but at different stages of their lives. So they will be talking about different things, but also we're talking about people who were children but are adults telling a story of what happened to them as children. And now we have a story of people who have aged and who are aging and facing different physical and emotional ailments, which is the emotional time. Telling my story when I'm 60 plus and telling my story where I'm close to 90 is very different. Yep.
First of all, fascinating what you're telling us. Secondly, I have a question to ask you. I had the experience, fortunately, to go to much of the living work with students with a survivor. And the message for him was, please give the message to the rest. Now, the child that come to Poland with a survivor, as you said, the lady, is very tangible, is very relevant to the person, to the child coming back. It was not understood when he came back to school. So how we can make relevant the survivor to the students that did not have experience in the same way that the other students had. Mm-hmm. So I'm scared, I'm very concerned that it will be dissolved like a piece of history rather than this was happened to us. Mm-hmm. So how we can make it relevant?
Well, look, first of all, so Stephen Smith from the USC divided a new idea of how to keep survivors, it's not just relevant but in relation. Because here we're going to be watching videos where we can't ask questions or we can't engage and see them in relationship. And this is a program called New Dimension, where basically Pintas particularly was filmed over, I don't know how many hours, I think it's, and asked 20,000 questions. 20,000 questions, and he was filmed by 20 cameras. And basically what happens, and it's now available in museums, there is a hologram where you basically meet Pintas as a hologram and you ask him questions. And it jumps to the part of the tape that's like, Pintas, where you would, I was born in Warsaw. Pintas, you remember any songs from your childhood? Oh, la, da, da, da. And you start 20,000 based on questions that they had collected from students who had listened to his testimony. What would they ask Pintas?
Is it at Yad Vashem or is that?
It's in the States, in the United States, it's in Canada. They've made 3 more with 3 different survivors. But this was the need of how to still keep us having a relationship. Because on the one, because I would say to you on the basic level, his or her story doesn't have to be relevant. But the actual meeting a survivor is the power of the experience. This is someone who went through this and survived, God knows somehow. And I have met them. But we will all remember our first meetings with a survivor, or one of the meetings with a survivor. It'll be part of who we are in terms of understanding the Shoah. That's going to be lost. So Stephen Smith said we're going to try and keep it, whether you like it or whether you're not. There's a whole debate. Can you have this hologram, eternity for survivors, keeping them alive, all this kind of weird stuff that's connected to it? It's certainly there, and there's certain critique. But here's the thing: is what is the power of Holocaust education today? It's their interaction with the survivor. Once we lose that, what are we going to do, right? So I would say in terms of and that's another issue. If you're on with a group, and one bus has Pintas, who is eloquent and erudite, and the other bus has, I don't know, someone else who isn't eloquent and erudite, and the group's saying like, they got the good survivor and we got the not great survivor, right? Whichever absolutely happens, right?
One who couldn't speak very good English.
Or we couldn't understand, or they story. Oh, they went to the Soviet Union. They weren't in Majdanek. We had the survivor went in Majdanek, right? We perpetuate the same hierarchy of suffering, and we have to grapple with survivors who. I recently went on a trip, and this survivor didn't speak a word the entire trip, and at some point these poor kids were like, So eventually we're like, you're with the survivor, She's with you. She didn't tell her story. She didn't tell her story, but you with. So that.
I feel like it's also important that we can't know what story is going to switch on a student. For all of us, there are different moments in our lives where we've had so many different experiences learning about it, and that some things, for whatever reasons, sink deeper than other experiences. So even in that example of the kids on the bus and talking with language that might be inappropriate, you've still got kids on the bus where they're thinking different things at different times, and I feel like we can't always, I feel like we have to give them trust as well, to be giving them these different experiences, even though it might not all be as excellent an educational experience as we might like, but there's trust in the students that actually they do switch on at different times to different things, and they are moved and they are affected, and I feel like we can't always look at it so darkly that they're not going to care.
Right.
They'll always be.
Right. Well, we're also protective over the survivors. We don't want them to be in a situation where they aren't seen or loved or protected as in the same way. But even in Pinchas's own life history, his testimonies, if you look and you Google him speaking here, as opposed to him speaking later on, are two different people. He's been speaking for 20 years by the time he's speaking here. He has a story, he has a narrative, he is more engaging, he has learned to become more articulate and dramatic. He's speaking in one of his early testimonies, and you see it, he's fumbling and he's looking down and he's completely, that is not that. And that's 20 years. So even within his own course of his lifetime, he has changed the way he speaks, the way he presents his story, and he also changes the way what he says. Mm-hmm. He changes what he says. And that's not because he's saying things that didn't happen to him, but he's picking and choosing different things at different times of his life. And he's also sharing a different understanding of how things happened. In the 1980s, he understood it in one way, and in 2000, he's understanding it a way that's completely different. And one of the interesting parts about testimonies, when you look at it as a field, is that how much of Pinchas's telling here is influenced by the times by how it evolves. So there's one classic example. Pinchas, when you speak to him today or you hear his testimony, he always talks about the fact that when he was in the Warsaw Ghetto and he was a young child, he said he had a film running over his forehead, and he was filming what he was seeing. That's why he just has a phenomenal memory of what happened, even when he was so young. So he has this image of a film camera, of a video recorder, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the issues is, once I had to do a study, and I was looking at, looking at his earlier testimony, and in his earlier testimony, he's describing one of the first traumatic moments he has, which is when they're in Warsaw, he's just moved there, and there is a raid on the apartment that he's living with his family, and the Nazis come into the apartment and force everyone to strip naked, and they search the apartment for any valuables that are hidden. And it's so traumatic for him because he is a Hasidic boy, and he has never seen anyone naked. His mother, his aunt, and for him that moment is complete. That's when he begins to say, this is where I understood the reality shifted. That's when it changed for him. When the children understand that what was happening to them has was different. And that was his moment. And he said in that moment, and he says, I was so crushed and shocked that I started to look at things. I started to record things, like he says, and he points to the camera, like you're recording me. He says, I started to record what was happening to me in the Warsaw Ghetto. So from a testimony of 1987, where he finds a way to communicate what happened to him in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940, he now has a language to then constantly use the fact that he became a video recorder. And he walked around the Warsaw Ghetto and he recorded what he saw. But it wasn't something that was born in 1943. He didn't have that epiphany then. He only had it when he saw the cameraman filming him and he said, ah.
Do you know which video that was?
So it's this one, or there's two earlier videos. It's the 87 or the 89. I think it could be this one. This is Paula Draper. This is the one he liked most from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. But it's his, I think it's his 89 testimony.
Because that's what it always is, about capturing the right extracts and excerpts to share with the students. We don't have all the time to go through the hours of their different reports at different ages, but we can only usually take
bits. Well, absolutely, because that's one of the big challenges of this field, is that we have, and I said it's data because it sounds pretty crude, but it is. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of hours of tape, right? Claude Lanzmann, they just released his off-takes to Shoah. Shoah is 9 hours. Now they're releasing everything he didn't make it into the film, right? We're talking about, but I have to say that when you go into, it depends what age, that basically you can probably use anything from testimony, as long as it's age appropriate and doesn't, and you can.
Is there that resource? I'm just curious. That thought's already been done in terms of excerpts appropriate for this age and appropriate, because there are layers. Because there are layers. I know that when I'm teaching Year 10, like I have to go through hours and hours before I find, and it's so much work. And if there's already that resource,
right,
and it's not on the Yad Vashem website, it's not on.
No, it's not. It could be. USC could have some sort of forum for teachers through Eyewitness. They have the Eyewitness program, which is very pedagogically orientated.
Right.
But for the most part, up until you get, but even then, someone could have an experience before they ghettoized. But up until essentially the ghetto period, then you just basically uncharted water. Anything could have happened to them. So it's difficult, but I do think that you don't have to spend. I think you can just find one testimony, and then within that one testimony find the segments, but also be transparent about that. When you take segments of testimony, you decontextualize the testimony, so people don't always know what's before, people don't know what's coming after, and you have to explain what you've brought and why. Because then it just becomes snippets, and then they just become illustrations, and not necessarily the person. You lose the individual story. So
what
that's.
do you think? Which age or which grade we can start teaching development?
That's tomorrow.
Tomorrow?
That's tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's tomorrow. So we run out of time. Thank you, Yigal, for giving me the sign.
Thank you very much.